The German radio room was already too quiet when the first transmission failed. It was early afternoon, gray light filtering weakly through reinforced windows deep beneath a command post outside Castle, and operators sat frozen at their consoles, headsets pressed tight, fingers hovering over switches that refused to respond. The war outside was loud, engines, artillery, distant aircraft, but down here, silence spread like a disease. A corporal leaned closer to the receiver, tapped it once, then again. Nothing. Another operator turned his dial slowly, methodically, as if discipline alone might force the signal back into existence. Still nothing. Somewhere far above them, divisions were moving without orders, aircraft were waiting for instructions that would never come, and commanders were making decisions blind. At that moment, no one in the bunker knew that the collapse of an entire regional communications network had begun hours earlier because one exhausted soldier chose a shortcut that was never meant to be taken. The story does not begin with sabotage, or spies, or bombs falling from the sky. It begins with fatigue. By 1944, German signal units were running on nerves, caffeine, and fear. The radio network that once symbolized German precision had become a tangled web of patched cables, overworked relay stations, and desperate improvisation. Allied bombing had forced redundancy upon redundancy. Lines were rerouted through forests, villages, even abandoned farm buildings. Field operators were trained to adapt, but not to question the system itself. That system depended on predictability. Routes were fixed. Procedures were rigid. And any deviation, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways no one could calculate. The soldier at the center of this story was not an officer. He would never appear in a photograph or a medal citation. He was a low-ranking signals runner assigned to a maintenance detachment responsible for inspecting relay junctions between mobile radio trucks and a hardened transmission hub. His job was simple: follow the prescribed route, inspect each junction point, log anomalies, and return. It was monotonous work, performed under constant threat of air attack, often at night, often in terrible weather. On the morning this story truly began, he was already behind schedule. The previous night's bombing had cratered roads, knocked down poles, and turned the official route into a maze of detours. He was tired, soaked through, and under pressure to report back before the next scheduled transmission window. That was when he noticed the path. It cut through a stand of trees behind an abandoned rail spur, shaved nearly 30 minutes off the route, and appeared, at first glance, harmless. Others had used it informally. There were footprints, tire tracks, no warning signs, no guards. It wasn't on the map, but in a war where maps were often outdated the moment they were printed, that wasn't unusual. He hesitated only briefly. The official path would take him through an exposed clearing recently strafed by fighters. The shortcut felt safer. Smarter. Almost clever. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the ground beneath that path concealed one of the most delicate components of Germany's improvised radio system, a buried signal splitter hastily installed weeks earlier to reroute high-priority command traffic around bombed infrastructure. It was never meant to be walked over repeatedly. It was never meant to be stressed. And it was never meant to be disturbed by equipment being dragged across it. As he crossed the clearing, the weight of his kit tugged behind him. Something snagged. He stopped, adjusted his grip, and gave a short pull to free it. Beneath his boots, the earth shifted, not dramatically, not enough to alarm him. He continued on, unaware that a protective casing had cracked, exposing a junction where moisture, vibration, and pressure would soon begin their quiet work. Hours later, the first relay station reported interference. Static. Signal drift. Operators compensated as they always did, adjusting frequencies, boosting power, logging it as another wartime inconvenience. But the interference didn't stabilize. It spread. One by one, frequencies dropped into noise. Backup channels fared no better. Somewhere deep in the system, a feedback loop began to form, amplifying distortion instead of correcting it. Engineers would later describe it as a cascade failure, each relay attempting to correct a problem that no longer had a single source. By the time the German command realized they were losing the network, it was already too late to isolate the fault. Orders were delayed. Coordinates were misheard. Air defense batteries fired late or not at all. Reconnaissance reports piled up unanswered. The war did not stop, but Germany's ability to control it began to fracture in real time. In the bunker outside Castle, an officer finally removed his headset and spoke the words no one wanted to hear. The system was down. Not jammed. Not bombed. And as technicians scrambled to trace the failure, they would soon discover that the collapse had not begun with Allied brilliance or overwhelming force, but with one soldier, one decision, and a shortcut that unraveled far more than a route through the woods. And the most terrifying part was this: even as they searched for the cause, the soldier who triggered it all was already walking back toward base, unaware that the war around him had just changed direction. The silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in unevenly, like a fog slipping through cracks in a fortress wall. In some sectors, radios still crackled with fragments of transmission, half-sentences, clipped coordinates, voices that dissolved mid-word. In others, nothing. German commanders were trained to operate under pressure, but they were not trained for uncertainty on this scale. Orders depended on confirmation. Confirmation depended on signal. And the signal now was unreliable at best, absent at worst. In field headquarters across central Germany, officers leaned over maps that were suddenly frozen in time, forced to make decisions based on information hours old, sometimes days. The war was moving faster than their understanding of it. At first, suspicion fell where it always did: Allied jamming. British deception units had made an art form of flooding German frequencies with false traffic. American bombers carried equipment designed to blind radar and overwhelm receivers. It made sense to assume this was another attack, another invisible assault meant to soften defenses before bombs followed. Requests went up the chain for confirmation. Was this an enemy action? Was this temporary? Could it be countered? The replies, when they came at all, offered no clarity. Entire regions were reporting the same phenomenon. Different equipment. Different operators. Same failure. Engineers were summoned. Older men, some veterans of the First World War, others young specialists rushed through training as the Reich grew desperate. They checked power supplies first. Then antenna alignments. Then frequency crystals. Everything appeared intact. The radios themselves were working. They transmitted perfectly into nothing. Somewhere between sender and receiver, the system was eating its own voice. In one command post, a general ordered a test transmission sent at maximum power, violating peacetime safety protocols that still lingered in manuals. The result was catastrophic. Instead of pushing the signal through, the surge fed the distortion, amplifying interference across adjacent channels. Nearby stations reported total blackout within minutes. It was as if the network had become a living thing, wounded, panicked, reacting violently to attempts at help. As confusion spread, fear followed close behind. German doctrine depended on centralized control. Blitzkrieg itself had been built on rapid communication, on the ability to concentrate force precisely where needed. Without radio, divisions became isolated islands. Infantry waited for artillery that never fired. Fighters scrambled too late, or not at all. Anti-aircraft crews stared at empty skies while bombers passed overhead elsewhere, unchallenged. And for the first time since the war began, German commanders felt something deeply unsettling. They were reacting instead of directing. Messages were dispatched by courier, motorcycles, trucks, even bicycles, but roads were choked with refugees, damaged by bombing, and watched from above. Couriers were delayed, killed, or captured. By the time orders arrived, they were often obsolete. A retreat ordered in the morning reached a unit by nightfall, after it had already been encircled. An attack planned at dawn went forward without air cover because the cancellation never arrived. Meanwhile, deep inside the technical core, a pattern began to emerge. The failure was not random. It followed a geographic logic, radiating outward from a cluster of relay points installed hastily during the spring. These were not part of the original network. They were improvisations, solutions born of necessity after Allied bombs shattered fixed infrastructure. They had been installed quickly, buried shallowly, protected just enough to function. And now, one by one, They were behaving as if poisoned. A senior signals officer studied the reports late into the night, tracing lines across a map with shaking fingers. He saw the overlap, the convergence. Whatever had gone wrong had not struck everywhere. It had struck somewhere specific, then spread. That realization brought no comfort. If this were sabotage, it meant the enemy had penetrated deeply. If it were mechanical failure, it meant Germany's system was far more fragile than anyone had admitted. Orders were issued to physically inspect the relay junctions. Teams were dispatched at dawn, armed not with rifles but shovels, meters, and desperate hope. They dug through wet soil, uncovering cables slick with moisture, insulation degraded, casings cracked just enough to let the earth inside. At one junction, an engineer found the splitter, misaligned, corroded, vibrating faintly as current pulsed through it in unstable loops. He stared at it in disbelief. This was not enemy action. This was wear. Just damage from above. And then the question no one wanted to ask formed silently in the room. How long had this been happening? Back at headquarters, reports from the front grew darker. Allied bombers were appearing with uncanny precision, striking targets that should have been concealed. Fighter escorts arrived exactly where German defenses were weakest. It felt as if the enemy knew what Germany could not even tell itself. The radio network, once a shield, had become a liability. Attempts to use it risked revealing positions through erratic transmissions. Silence, once feared, now felt safer than speech. And still, no one knew the cause. The soldier who took the shortcut remained anonymous, just another name on a roster, just another body moving through the machinery of war. He filed his report late, mentioning nothing unusual. Why would he? He had seen nothing break, heard nothing fail. The damage he caused was invisible, delayed, far removed from his boots on the forest floor. By the time investigators would trace the collapse back to that point, days would have passed. Lives would have been lost. Opportunities missed. The balance would have shifted again. What German command was beginning to understand, slowly, painfully, was that their war was no longer being undone by grand offensives or decisive battles. It was being eaten away by small failures, by exhaustion, by shortcuts taken in a system that could no longer tolerate them. And as the radio room stayed silent and the maps turned red, a terrible truth crept in. Germany was not losing control because the enemy was stronger. It was losing control because its own war machine could no longer hold itself together. By the third day, the silence had become lethal. On the front lines, German soldiers no longer waited for orders, they waited for guesses. Battalion commanders studied the sky, the roads, the faces of their men, trying to decide what came next without knowing what was happening even 10 kilometers away. Radios were still carried, still powered on, still adjusted obsessively, but no one trusted what came through them. A burst of static could be enemy interference, or a dying relay screaming its last distortion into the system. Either way, it was useless. The war had entered a phase Germany was never prepared for: decentralization under fire. In one sector, an armored unit halted at a crossroads, engines idling, fuel burning away while officers argued over a map marked with yesterday's information. Recon patrols had reported Allied armor moving east, but without confirmation from higher command, no one knew whether to advance, hold, or retreat. The radio operator kept trying, cycling through frequencies until his headset hissed like a storm trapped inside a skull. Finally, the commander made a decision based purely on instinct. It was the wrong one. Within hours, the unit would be flanked, cut off, and destroyed. Another formation erased not by superior firepower, but by absence of coordination. Elsewhere, Luftwaffe pilots scrambled into the air chasing phantoms. Ground controllers, deprived of stable communication, vectored fighters toward bomber formations that had already passed, or worse, sent them directly into Allied fighter screens. Losses mounted rapidly. Pilots returned shaken, reporting enemy escorts appearing where none should have existed, defending bombers all the way to targets once considered unreachable. The sky itself seemed to belong to the enemy now, not because Germany lacked planes, but because it lacked timing. In air defense batteries scattered across cities and industrial zones, the breakdown was even more cruel. Radar operators could still see the incoming raids. They could hear them. But coordination with gun crews faltered. Orders to concentrate fire arrived late or not at all. Ammunition was expended at the wrong moments, leaving batteries silent when bombers flew directly overhead. Civilians watching from shelters would later swear the guns had simply stopped firing, as if Germany had given up. In truth, the guns were waiting for commands trapped in a dead network. Behind the lines, the effects rippled outward into logistics. Trains carrying fuel and ammunition sat idle, waiting for clearance that never came. Others moved blindly, colliding schedules, clogging rail hubs already damaged by bombing. Entire depots were left undefended because reassignment orders were lost in transmission. Allied reconnaissance aircraft noticed the chaos almost immediately. Targets that once shifted unpredictably now stayed fixed, exposed, vulnerable. The enemy adapted faster than Germany could repair itself. Inside German headquarters, tempers flared. Accusations flew. Someone had failed. Someone had sabotaged the system. Someone had lied. Investigations were launched even as the crisis worsened, because the command structure needed someone to blame. Engineers insisted the equipment was sound, at least before. Officers demanded explanations that no one could give. Each hour without answers eroded confidence, not just in the network, but in leadership itself. It was during one such confrontation that the most dangerous realization surfaced. The radio collapse had not merely silenced Germany, it had revealed Germany. Allied forces were moving with uncanny assurance, striking where defenses were weakest, exploiting gaps that German command could no longer conceal through rapid redeployment. The war had become transparent on one side and opaque on the other. For the first time, German officers began to suspect that the enemy was not just reacting to German movements, but anticipating them. And anticipation breeds fear. As night fell, attempts were made to restore limited communication through field telephones and wired lines. But these too had been damaged, rerouted, compromised. Improvised networks sprang up, fragile and slow. A message that once took seconds now took hours. Decisions that once shaped battles now arrived after battles were already lost. The tempo of war, once Germany's greatest weapon, had turned against it. Some commanders attempted to act independently, reviving older doctrines of local initiative. In a few cases, it worked. In many others, it resulted in chaos, units advancing into friendly fire, counterattacks launched without support, withdrawals ordered too late. The lack of a common operational picture turned bravery into waste. Men died not because they were outmatched, but because they were alone. Meanwhile, deep in the repair detachments, the source of the collapse was finally being isolated. Engineers traced the distortion backward through damaged relays, narrowing the zone where the failure had begun. They dug deeper, uncovering soil churned subtly, repeatedly, as if walked over many times. At one junction, they found the cracked casing fully exposed, water pooled inside, metal contacts eaten away by corrosion accelerated by vibration. This was not enemy sabotage. This was accidental destruction. The truth was almost unbearable in its simplicity. No bombs, no spies, no grand deception, just pressure, fatigue, a shortcut. As reports filtered upward, disbelief gave way to something darker, humiliation. The German war machine, once feared for its precision, had been crippled by the smallest human decision. An exhausted soldier, trying to save time, had stepped where doctrine never imagined he would. And in doing so, he had exposed a weakness so profound it could not be fixed quickly, if at all. By the time emergency repairs stabilized fragments of the network, the damage was already done. Entire operations had failed. Air superiority had slipped further away. Confidence, among soldiers, pilots, commanders, had been shaken to its core. The silence had not just disrupted Germany's war. It had changed how Germany understood itself. The moment Germany's commanders understood what had happened, the war tilted sharply, not with an explosion but with a quiet, irreversible shift. Somewhere deep beneath the noise of collapsing fronts and burning cities, a colder realization settled in. The enemy now knew Germany could be blinded, not by brilliance, not by overwhelming force, but by fragility. And once a weakness is discovered, it is never unseen again. Allied signals intelligence units began to notice patterns that hadn't existed before. German radio traffic, once disciplined and dense, became erratic. Bursts of desperate transmissions appeared on unsecured channels, followed by long silences. Entire formations vanished from the electromagnetic spectrum. To Allied analysts, this wasn't confusion, it was opportunity. They adjusted immediately, rerouting air raids and ground thrusts to exploit the growing gaps, striking where German coordination could no longer respond in time. In the West, Allied armored columns advanced faster than planners had expected. Resistance appeared disjointed, sporadic. German units fought fiercely when they encountered the enemy, but the fights were isolated, disconnected from any larger plan. Breakthroughs widened not because Allied tanks were unstoppable, but because no coordinated counterattack ever arrived. German divisions, once masters of synchronized movement, now fought like islands in a rising sea. The psychological effect on German soldiers was devastating. Men who had been trained to trust orders, timetables, and coordination began to doubt everything. If the radio crackled to life with an instruction, they hesitated. Was it real, outdated, intercepted, misunderstood? Trust, once broken, did not return easily. Some officers resorted to messengers on motorcycles, runners carrying handwritten notes through artillery fire. Too often, the messages arrived after the moment had passed. In the air, the consequences were even more visible. Allied bombers flew deeper, escorted longer, striking targets that once lay beyond reach. German fighter squadrons scrambled too late or in the wrong direction. Pilots climbed into skies already controlled by the enemy, encountering formations positioned exactly where German command believed they would not be. Losses mounted. Veterans whispered that something fundamental had changed, that the war had turned invisible against them. Inside German headquarters, panic tried to disguise itself as discipline. Emergency directives were issued, demanding tighter radio protocols, redundancy checks, equipment inspections. But orders alone could not repair morale. Officers began speaking more quietly, glancing around before voicing concerns. The belief that Germany's systems were superior, more efficient, more resilient, had been punctured. And once punctured, ideology offered no repair kit. In one command center, a senior officer stared at a wall map covered in pins, each representing a unit still operational. He noticed something chilling. The pins no longer moved in harmony. Lines that once advanced together now staggered, bent, stalled. The war no longer flowed. It fractured. And in fragmentation, strength dissolved. Meanwhile, Allied planners leaned into the collapse with ruthless efficiency. Feints were launched knowing German responses would lag. False movements were exaggerated, drawing forces away from real targets. Entire offensives were timed to exploit radio dead zones. The enemy didn't need to destroy Germany's army, they only needed to keep it confused. Reports began reaching Berlin that sounded impossible only weeks earlier. German units surrendering unexpectedly. Towns falling without coordinated defense. Supply columns captured intact because rerouting orders never arrived. The war machine, still powerful on paper, was bleeding out through misalignment. And beneath it all lingered the unbearable truth. None of this was planned by the enemy. The collapse had been invited. The soldier who took the shortcut would never know the full extent of what followed. He would not see the maps, the intercepted messages, the stalled divisions. He would not hear the whispers in command rooms or the silence on the airwaves. He had simply wanted to save time. And in saving minutes, he had cost Germany weeks, then months. By now, German leadership understood something even more dangerous than defeat: inevitability. Wars are not lost when armies run out of men or weapons. They are lost when systems fail faster than they can be repaired. When decision-making slows. When confidence evaporates. As winter closed in, German command tried to regain control through rigidity, tightening authority, punishing deviation, demanding obedience. But rigidity could not compensate for blindness. Orders piled up unanswered. The initiative died. The enemy moved freely through spaces Germany could no longer see. And somewhere in the static, another truth whispered its way through the silence. If this could happen once, it could happen again. The network was no longer sacred. The system was no longer invulnerable. The war had revealed a crack, and through it poured doubt. The shortcut had done more than break a radio line. It had broken the illusion of control. By the time Germany attempted to rebuild what had been lost, the war no longer resembled the one it believed it was fighting. Orders still went out. Reports still came in. Radios still crackled with voices, coordinates, and code words. But something essential was gone: faith. Not in ideology, not even in victory, but in the machinery that had once made those ideas seem inevitable. Commanders began making decisions that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. They delayed attacks not because the enemy was strong, but because they no longer trusted their own timing. They refused to redeploy units without visual confirmation, slowing response times to a crawl. Entire formations were held back, not as reserves, but as insurance against uncertainty. Momentum, Germany's defining weapon, evaporated. On the ground, soldiers adapted in small, desperate ways. Some units established their own local signals, flags, runners, improvised codes whispered between foxholes. Others simply waited, frozen between conflicting instructions. In the absence of coordination, courage became random. Sacrifice became isolated. Victories, when they occurred, could not be exploited. Losses, when they happened, cascaded. In the air, the shift was unmistakable. Allied bombers returned again and again, striking deeper, with fewer losses, their escorts appearing exactly where German pilots did not expect them. Once, German fighter aces spoke of reading the sky like a chessboard. Now, the board seemed rearranged mid-game. Veterans began refusing missions under the guise of mechanical failure. New pilots, rushed into service, were overwhelmed by a war that no longer followed predictable rules. Behind the scenes, German intelligence tried to understand how the enemy always seemed one step ahead. Investigations multiplied. Conspiracies were suspected. Sabotage was assumed. But the truth, when it was finally accepted, was more corrosive than any external enemy. The system had failed itself. The war machine had turned inward, brittle and self-destructive. In Berlin, the silence around the incident grew deliberate. No medals were awarded. No lessons publicly acknowledged. The event was buried under layers of other disasters, other excuses. To admit that a single, ordinary action had unraveled such a vast apparatus was to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability was forbidden. But the effects could not be erased. As months passed, Germany's strategic posture grew increasingly defensive, not just in territory, but in mindset. Commanders reacted instead of planned. Initiatives came from the enemy. Surprise belonged to the Allies now. Every German move felt anticipated, countered, absorbed. The belief that victory could still be seized, through boldness, through will, faded quietly, replaced by endurance, then survival. And when soldiers spoke of the war's turning points, they no longer named great battles alone. They spoke of moments when things simply stopped working. When orders didn't arrive. When help didn't come. When the system failed them. Years later, after the war ended and the ruins were measured, historians would search for decisive moments. They would point to invasions, bombings, conferences, betrayals. But buried in the footnotes, almost invisible, was another kind of ending, a psychological one. The moment Germany realized that its advantage was not strength, but coordination. And that coordination, once broken, could not be restored under pressure. The shortcut was never recorded in any official history. No map marked the spot. No monument commemorated it. But its legacy lived on in the empty airwaves, in the missed opportunities, in the growing certainty among German commanders that the war was no longer theirs to shape. Belief does not collapse with noise. It collapses with silence. And in that silence, Germany's belief in victory died, not in a blaze of destruction, but in the quiet realization that control had slipped away forever.